Good to go there. So we will share. Oops. Okay. So where we left off was at the phallic phase, and we're not going to go back and rehearse the first three phases because I kind of want to get on to our next theory dealing with cognition. But it is worth noting the last two stages that Freud talked about because they did have an impact on the study of child development and human development as a whole. Okay. Because what Freud is going to say is that between the age of 6 and puberty, that really nothing happens. Nothing significantly developmentally happens during this age. We learn some basic living skills like reading and writing and how to, wash the dishes, all those kinds of things. So we learn skills of life, but nothing really occurs during this period of life. And I've always felt that this is an unfortunate statement for one of the first theories of development, because if you're going to go into studying child development, this is a good age group to study because Freud kind of said that, researchers after him kind of also ignored these elementary year age children. Okay. And there's really little known about, for example, the family dynamics that go on during this age, the individual dynamics. Most of what we know about the elementary ed years comes from studies done in elementary schools and through elementary education. And so we know a lot about these children's school lives, and we know that they develop, for example, friendships and friends become just as important as, for example, siblings and those kinds of things. But that comes from studies from school, not necessarily from us actually going and observing these children outside of those environments. Now, there are increasing studies in our modern psychology, but this is largely an age group that has been largely neglected, at least within the area of child psychology. Okay. So then the last stage that Freud talked about was the age of going through puberty. And we'll talk much more about this when we get to socio-emotional development, about the puberty age and what occurs during this time. But the important thing to state is that um, we know that children go through a stage of leaving kind of their child body and they're transitioning into their adult body. Okay. Before about this age of about 7, 8 years old, most children start to go through puberty starting around 7 and 8. Okay. Before that age group, if we did not genderize our children, meaning that we dress girls and boys exactly the same, gave them the same haircuts, we actually wouldn't be able and treated them the same. We actually wouldn't be able to tell the difference between little girls and little boys because they're what's considered androgynous until they start going through puberty and they start to develop their secondary sex features such as breasts and body hair and all of those kinds of things. So, um, so this is a period of time where the child is now transitioning into their adult body with adult intentions. Okay. And I hope you don't have any kids around. Real quick, just plug their ears if you do. This is where kids go from, hold on just a second, collecting my thoughts. Make sure I say this. Make sure you have your kids' ears plugged. This is where many children go from childhood, for example, masturbation to adult masturbation, where these things start to take on a fantasy type of things. This is where we truly start to get interested in the objects that we are attracted to, whether it be the same sex, different sex, whatever it may be. This is when we're starting to get into the attraction component of adult sexuality. Okay. And again, what Freud argued is if someone doesn't isn't able to understand adult interactions on a sexual level, they can become fixated on this, and they can either become hypersexual, meaning they seek out sex indiscriminately, or hyposexual, they avoid it and try not to engage in it. Okay. Now, I will say on this end, Freud is a little bit wrong on that end, in that there's a lot more other variables that go into playing children's sexual behaviors other than just developing an adult body and transitioning into a fantasy with others versus the self. And so I think that this needs a little bit more work, and we'll get to this and give this a little bit more detail when we get to emotional social development. Okay. But again, this period ends at 18, where Freud and many others at the time said that's when we stop to develop. But by the age of 18, we have all of our adult capacities, all of those things. If you're a parent, you know different, and we know that the brain doesn't actually start to fully develop on average. There's many of you that are far advanced uh, in this area, but the average for at least Americans is that adulthood probably starts at around the age of 26, 27. There is a gender difference on this. It's usually the gender is females average around the age of 21, where males average around the age of 34 before they completely mature as adults. Now that's averages. Again, there's a whole wide range of possibilities. So if you're one of those who are young and are very mature, you don't need to wait till you're 21 or 20, 34. This is just averages across the population. So those are some kind of criticisms of this. Now, I had mentioned that there were a lot of post-Freudians who didn't appreciate Freud's emphasis on the sexual components of human development. And one of them that is important to note was Alfred Adler. At the beginning of this lecture, I introduced different drives that we may have, and Adler felt that our primary drive was to overcome our inferiority from being born helpless in our world. Okay. And so that's where that neo-Freudian aspect is. And you'll see reading neo-Freudian writings, a lot of people disagreed with Freud about this. Um, in fact, there's about three different theories that we could get into if we had time. But I do just want to emphasize that not all Freudians really follow the dictum that Freud set. They said there's other types of drives that we have, and it's just not limited to those two. So just wanted to emphasize that. So this is going to kind of end kind of the biological drive of things. And now we need to get kind of into the psychological world of stuff. So we have these drives that keep us surviving and adapting in the world. Um, so now how do we start to develop how we think about the world? And then how do we interact emotionally and socially with the world? Okay. So the next theory we're going to talk about as an example of cognitive theory is Jean Piaget's theory. Okay. Um, And probably an important part of Piaget's theory is that one, he stressed the interaction of the child and the world through construction and adaptation, meaning that he strongly believed that children um, actively engage their world and construct their world as they grow and develop through time. Okay, but he also his theory is also like Freud's a stage theory, that there's certain periods of life that a child is capable on taking more complex cognitive tasks on as they grow and become older. Okay. Now, the two primary ways that Piaget thought that we construct our world is through what's called assimilation and accommodation. Okay. So I'm just going to kind of point these two out. Assimilation is when we assimilate um, information in our world and we create a purpose for it. All right. So I'm going to use a bottle for an example. So an infant is presented with a bottle, and in the beginning, mom or dad show the infant kind of how to use the bottle. So they hold the bottle for them. They have, they put the nipple in the baby's mouth and kind of are assistive in teaching the infant the use of a bottle. Okay. And this is the process of assimilation. Here's this new object that has a purpose, and I create then kind of this object relationship with this bottle, that it's a source of substance, and it's a source, a way for me to ingest and get food. Okay. But then all of a sudden, sometime down the road, when my motor skills get better, mom and dad give me something called a cup. All right. And yeah, mom and dad may kind of show the infant, this is what you do with the cup. But if you've had an infant or a baby by this time and age, you know that that baby feels like that cup is more of an object that makes a really cool loud sound. It's a drum. It's something that can fly across the room. It doesn't taste too great when I put it in my mouth. And they start to just to figure out, what is this object worth? Is it a toy? Is it something that I'm supposed to use in order to survive in the world, as you would say? But eventually, what they learn is that there's a bottle, and now they have this new object that is totally different, that can be used for the same purpose the bottle was eventually. And this is the process of accommodation. You can have two objects that um, are used for the same thing, but are different things. One's a bottle, one's a cup, but they can be used, and then they accommodate the use of a cup versus a bottle. I like to think of this in another simple way, is the differentiation between dogs and cats. Okay. So, and this is where we introduce the word schema, which is another word that was given to us by our friend Piaget. A schema is a general representation of something. Okay. So we know that dogs come in all size, shapes, furriness, but there's features of them that we can tell that a Chihuahua and a Pit Bull are both dogs. Okay. So we have this general schema of a dog, which we can fit the small ones and the big ones in. Okay, so maybe it's the barking, their mannerisms, the way they treat their owner, all those kinds of things. But then let's say we introduce a cat. Now, a cat is very similar to a dog. It walks on four legs. It has whiskers. They come in different furrinesses. They're very similar, but they have significant enough differences. One barks, one meows. One has incredibly sharp claws, the other one doesn't. They have different mannerisms. And so in this situation, we can't assimilate a cat into our dog schema. No, what we have to do is accommodate a brand new category between dog and cat because there's enough dissimilarities between them that we can't combine them, so we then separate them. Um, I think of a story just really quick. It's kind of an assimilation, accommodation kind of story. My grandson was at school and and they were doing this activity, I think, at the Desert Museum and everything. And the person was talking about bobcats and showing pictures of bobcats and my grandson raises his hand and he goes, "Well, what about Bob dogs?" So he's not quite at the assimilation accommodation stage between bobcats and their non-existent bob dogs, but it's kind of reminds me of this assimilation accommodation things. But anyways, that's a funny kind of anecdote on that topic. All right, so through this simulation and accommodation and construction and adaptation of our world, we start to create schemas or symbolizations of our world. Okay. The schemas are very general but symbols can have very specific meaning. Okay. Based on this, Piaget developed four stages of development that again goes from birth to about the age of 18 or through adulthood, if you want to put it that way. Now, we're going to make adjustments to Piaget's theory when I'm done, but I want to introduce it in its pure form so that we kind of understand where he was coming from and how it was originally developed. And then we'll come back and we'll make some adjustments to it. Okay. But what Piaget argued is that what is the task of a 0 to 2 year old? Okay. For Piaget, what he believed is that the task of a birth to 2 year old is to understand the connections between a person's body, motor movements, and actions and the sensations they're experiencing in the world. Okay. So it's about coordinating motor response with our sensory input and understanding how those interact. Okay. Hence, when you see a baby and what do they do with everything, they try to look at objects with all their senses. So they get a toy, they'll put it in their mouth, they'll look at it, they'll push it, they'll manipulate it in order to understand the relationship between them and the sensation that they're experiencing. Okay. Um, but unlike Freud's theory, Piaget noted some differences between each of his stages that can be marked and measured. And what Piaget believed that the end of the sensory motor period into more of our psychological world was when a baby developed what's called object permanence. Okay. And what object permanence is understanding that an object still exists even if that object is not within our sensory capacity. Okay. And so I want you to use your imagination because this is how Piaget went about measuring object permanence. So let's put mom, we'll put mom, M for mom, or can put P for Piaget. And we're going to put mom and or Piaget on one side of this little table here. Okay. And then we're going to put the child on this side of the um, table. Okay. This thing right here is kind of a curtain. Okay. And what we'll use mom. What mom's going to do is she's going to take the child's favorite teddy bear. Use your imagination. Um, I'm hoping this works out. And what she's going to do is have the child interact with it and see it. And then in front of the child, mom's going to pick up the teddy bear and she's going to put it behind this curtain. Okay. And then observe what the child does. If the child's verbal, they'll say, "What happened to the teddy bear?" If the child is nonverbal, they'll see whether the child looks for or wants to know where the teddy bear went. Okay, whether they'll follow it or not. All right. And what at the time, with this kind of technology in hand, what Piaget observed is that children under the age of 2, if the child was verbal and mom took the bear and put it behind the curtain and asked the child, "Where did the teddy bear go?" The child would say, "Well, I don't know. It's gone." What teddy bear? Okay. If the child was nonverbal, what mom or Piaget would observe is that the child would then just go on to whatever else was in the room. They would go try and figure out, well, what else is interesting here? Okay. Now, if the child was around the age of 2, and of course, around the age of 2, children are semi-verbal. What mom would observe is that around 24 months, and I'm going to put this in kind of adult terms, just kind of hurry this conversation up, is mom would go, "Well, where did your teddy bear go?" And the child would probably, this is what I imagine in my mind. The child looks at mom and goes, "Mom, you're being a little ridiculous. It's right in this curtain." And they go and push the curtain aside and get their teddy bear. Okay. Why does this occur according to Piaget? Because the infant is now able to hold objects in their mind. They're able to realize that things exist outside the physical realm of the world. Okay. And so Piaget felt that this was a period of time. If a child's able to hold objects in their mind, this is when a child goes from just trying to interact and understand their interaction with the world to mentally representing the world in a symbolic way. Okay, so this is where children start to develop the meaning of a teddy bear, the meaning of mom, dad, the meaning of a brother, sister. This is where they start to have a huge explosion in language. I think I've mentioned this in the class before. Between the age of 2 to 6, the average child learns somewhere between 20 to 60,000 words. And if you want to think of those words, those are symbols. They're symbolizing something through language. Okay. And so this period of time represents this whole explosion of being able to mentally symbolize a child's world. Okay. Now, with that overwhelming amount of information comes some hallmarks of this age of development. One is irreversibility. Okay. This is the inability to understand that once something is taken apart, you can still put it back together. Okay. Meaning that children during this age, if they take their Hot Wheels apart, the Hot Wheels is now apart. It can't be put back together. Okay. And this is why in a lot of preschools and whatnot, they encourage children to work with Legos and blocks and those kinds of things so that they start to develop this understanding that, yeah, so you broke your Legos apart, but you can still put them back together. So it's helping them develop that skill that things are not permanent once they're taken apart. Okay. And then centration and egocentrism. Okay. If you think about this period of time, the child is still pretty vulnerable. They're learning about themselves. They're gaining a sense of self. And they start to recognize that it seems like this world is all about me. My parents pay attention to me, grandma and grandpa pay attention to me, and everything in this world must be for me from my perspective. So that's centrism, which then develops egocentrism, this belief that you are this kind of the center of the world. Okay. Um, and so the child tends to believe that they are kind of this all encapsulating, and the world is kind of theirs for their taking and for their response. Okay. There's two time periods in our life that on average we will score high on egocentrism. Okay. And this is during this early childhood period between the age of 2 and 7, and then it's going to reappear again in our teen years. Those are the two age groups that tend to measure the highest in egocentrism. And we will talk about that more when we get to socio-emotional development about why that is. Okay. Now, with this overwhelming information, if you could imagine, you've learned 20 to 60,000 words, and you've kind of kept them separated, and you have all of this information in your brain. You have to organize it somehow. But that requires us to mentally manipulate information. It requires us to be able to take information in our mind and, in a way, mentally, physically manipulate it. So Piaget developed some tasks that would kind of hopefully kind of differentiate this difference between what is called the pre-operational phase and the concrete operational phase. Okay. And so I want to kind of rehearse a couple of the tasks that he developed. Okay. The first one is conservation tasks, okay, which we'll use what's called the clay example or the beaker example for, okay. And then the other one is what's called the three mountain task. So let's kind of take a look at these. So this is what's known as the three mountain task. Okay, yes, it is here. This is what's known as a three mountain task. So as you can see up here, we have this light green, taller, wider tree. And then on another side, we have a darker green tree, shorter, kind of thinner. And then we have this broader, kind of in between green hill, or this mountain, as you would say. Okay. And what Piaget or mom would ask in this task is Piaget would sit on one side of the table and the child would sit on the other. And Piaget would start and say, ask the child what they see, what was their perspective of what they say. And of course, children of no matter age would say, well, I see this whiter, light green tree than the other shade of mountain, and then I see this darker green tree in the background. Okay. And children, verbal, who can understand this task, all gave this answer. Okay. The manipulation was really in the next task, the next question that Piaget would ask. Is Piaget would ask, "What do I see?" Okay. And what Piaget found is an age difference. He found that children under the age of about 6 to 7 would give their original response. They would say, well, Piaget, you see the light green, the mountain, and then the dark green tree. But children above the age of 6 and 7 would give the more appropriate answer. And they go, well, Piaget, you would probably see, and I'm trying to remember which one Piaget would see. He's kind of the green. They would properly say this one. Well, no, 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 no. They would properly say number two. They would say, well, you see the dark green one on your left side, you see the mountain, and then you see the light green tree. Okay. And so now you might think, well, that seems pretty simple of a task. But I want you to think about what this actually mentally required the child to do, because the child didn't physically go around and look at what Piaget saw. They had to give his perspective from what they were seeing. Okay. What this task requires the child to do is mentally rotate that table around so that they could see what Piaget saw. All right. So this meant that the child is able to mentally manipulate their world. They're able to take objects in their mind, and without physically seeing anything else, they're able to mentally manipulate it. Right. That's task one. And this happens around the age of about 6 to 7. The next task is what's called a conservation task. Okay, and I mentioned clay in the introduction, but this is kind of a more um, uh, easier to visualize one. I think I might have the clay one here too. No, I don't. But this is the beaker test that he did. This is a kind of a version of the clay test. Is what Piaget would do is he'd have two beakers of the same size and then a beaker that was a different size. So you can see these are the same and this one's taller and thinner. And he would have equal amount of liquid in A and B. Okay. And he'd ask the child, does A and B have the same amount of water? And children of any age would mainly say, yes, of course, they have the same amount. Okay. But again, the manipulation came into is in front of the child, Piaget would pour water from B into C and then ask the child again, is there the same amount of water in beaker A now in beaker C? Okay. And again, what he found is at around the age of 6 to 7, children under this age would say no, there's either less or more water in C than there is A. It was only after the age of 6 to 7 that the child would correctly say, no, it's the same amount, it's just changed shape. Okay. This is called conservation because it's basically kind of a physics law that just if you take an amount of something and you shape it differently, put it in something else, the mass of it doesn't change, just the shape. And that's why it's called a conservation task. Okay. And so what is a child learning here? Well, they're learning that you can mentally see something different, but it can still be the same thing. Okay. Which requires, again, that more mental ability to understand the world and mentally represent it instead of just looking at the physical qualities of the world. All right. So let's go back to here. So at around the age of 6 to 7, children are able to do the mental rotation tasks and the conservation tasks, which then we start to note from an observational level. This is also where children are able to start putting things in categories. So we're going to start taking that 20 to $60,000, 60,000, I wish $60,000, 20 to 60,000 words, and we're going to start putting those into categories. So we're going to start to categorize things into men, women, all of those different categories that we have that make the world easier to manage, that make it so that when we walk into a room of 100 people, we can easily put them into categories to try and figure out which people I belong to, which people I want to avoid, all of those kinds of things. I can tell the difference between trucks and cars, for example, or in other terms, Chevys and Fords. All right. Um, Now, you might be asking, why is this called the concrete operational phase? Okay. Well, if you've ever talked to a kiddo between the age of 7 to 11, they talk in what is called absolutes or what is known as black and white thinking. So there's black, there's white. There's good guys, there's bad guys. There's robbers, there's policemen. There's good, there's bad. There's no overlap between categories. Things are in a solid category, that's where they belong, and they can't interact with each other. Okay. And so it becomes very concrete in the categorization that we have. And this is why we have dichotics, right? We have men and women during this age group. We have blondes and brunettes. Um, and in these categories, they become very rigid. All right. Now, what happens again, if you look at this, this is puberty. We're getting into more types of higher logic thinking, is that what Piaget theorized is that we go from this concrete phase to what is known as formal operation phase, which I think, unfortunately, he used paper and pencil tests to determine whether someone thinks concretely or what is known as abstractly. Okay. Because what Piaget theorized is that the final stage of development is the ability to think abstractly, logically, and systematically. Okay. If I were to give, going back to our concrete examples, this is when a person learns that a police officer, while they do good things as police officers, they can also do bad things. A convict did a bad thing, but they also could have good qualities. I often think about this when, again, I worked in the prison system. There were people in there. I worked in a women's prison. There were women in there that did awful things. They stole, they did drugs, they broke the law. Um, but they weren't just an inmate. They weren't just a convict. Because when I went and watched them during visitation, a lot of them were wonderful mothers. A lot of them made good friends. A lot of them had a strong faith. A lot of them engaged in helping behaviors within the facility. And so they weren't just a criminal that the concrete operational phase sets them up for. Okay. And police officers don't always do what's right. Okay. And again, I think about I went to a conference with some police officers, and it was the scariest ride of my life because up where were at, instead of taking roads, they would take alleyways, and they would go down those alleyways doing 60, 70 miles per hour through residential areas and whatnot. And at the end of the ride, they want to know. They turned around to me and said, "You know what, Curtis? There's no speed limits in alleyways." And that was their justification to do that, what I thought was dangerous and scary driving. So cops don't always make the best kind of decisions. So that's kind of my kind of lived example of that. But I've also, when I worked in the field of abuse and whatnot, there was a large portion of domestic abusers are law enforcement. Um, and whatnot. So those are just examples of formal operations thinking. Okay. Now, that's Piaget's theory in the beginning and whatnot. So I want to give some updates on this theory. Is one, the idea of categorization. We've actually found that categorization actually starts to develop very early in infancy. In fact, we can see 6 months, years old, being able to categorize things. Okay. Object permanence has been observed as early as 3 months of age. Um, and so some of these things need to be updated. But what we do know is that a person's object permanence is the age of 2, and a person categorized by the age of 7. Okay. Now, this becomes more of the complicated story of Piaget's theory. This is one of the most well-tested developmental theories in psychology. And it's one of the few developmental theories that have been tested outside of um, outside of Western culture. This has been tested in the Amazons, in the uh, European countries, African countries, Asian countries. This has been tested uh, a lot cross-culturally. And what this has also led is to an update into Piaget's theory. Is we shouldn't say in modern developmental psychology, we shouldn't really be saying that formal operations is the um, best human capacity a person should have. It's not what it's, it really isn't, shouldn't be the stage that makes us thrive and survive the best, given our environment and given our situation. Instead, what we should be thinking about with this theory is that we develop to a stage of development that makes us experts for the environment we live in. All right. So I'm going to bring up some cultural examples. So if we look at, for example, the United States and Germany, which I'll deal with a G, okay, about 80% of people who have been tested in the United States uh, stay at stage 3, at the concrete development stage. Only about 20% of people in the United States go to formal operations. However, in Germany, 90% go up to formal operations. All right. Now, let's not stop there. Let's go to the Amazon, to some indigenous tribes in the Amazon. Okay. The majority, the range is between 80 to about 90% of indigenous people in the Amazon that have been tested stop at stage 2. And so I'll put A for Amazon. So does this make Americans more superior than indigenous tribes in the Amazon and makes Germans more superior than both of these groups? The answer is no. And let me explain why. Let's first talk about the difference between the United States and Germany. Okay. If you had noted in the 20th century, Germany went through kind of some horrific things with World War I and World War II. And they saw what would be considered nationalism at its best, where all that matters is what the authority figure says. And if you don't obey that authority figure, you're going to be eliminated. Before that period of time, they were the hub of human intellectualism. Again, it's where we get our first psychological lab. It's where we're going to see the beginnings of people like Einstein and Freud. And then they have this fascism that comes into play. Okay. How do you deal with this dichotomy between nationalism, fascism that controls everything and makes you think in black and white, and this history of intellectualism? Well, you have to deal with it in the abstract, in logic, in systems thinking. You can't see the world as black and white. They saw the dangers of seeing the world in black and white. And so to survive in German culture, it requires abstract thinking. Now, let's go to the United States. United States, I think we've all heard the term, is a land of law and rule, where pretty much based on Constitution and then laws that have been built on the Constitution, here in the United States, what do you need to know to survive and thrive? Well, what you need to know is what to do right and to avoid what to do wrong. Because what you do right, you prosper with. What you do wrong with, you're punished for. Okay. And you can think of our legal system as an example of that. All right. So, what you need to know is the concrete rules of existence in the United States. You don't need to think about the abstractness of it to survive here. Okay. Um, and so that's the way to survive here in the United States. And given that the United States in some more physical proof of this, we're only about 44% college educated. And this isn't an insult. If you think about the United States and its economic powers and everything, this is what makes the United States successful. Well, what's making Germany successful right now is that ability to think abstractly. Okay. So, what creates success is not necessarily the type of thinking of a stage four person. Okay. Let's go to the Amazon. All right. What does it take to survive in the Amazon? It takes the ability to know the difference between what would appear to someone from the United States and Germany the same exact leaf, but to know which one is edible and which one is not. It takes the ability to understand where different species are. It takes the understanding of where trails lead to and exist in, where you get food, where you can't get food, um, who is part of your tribe, who's not part of your tribe. It takes the ability to clearly symbolize your world and understand where your world is. Now, we need to take this part out of this experience because they're not more egocentric. In fact, they're more communal than this. So this part of stage two, don't think about with this individual and this irreversibility. These parts don't matter. What matters is what needs to develop in this part of the world is the ability to symbolize and understand very minute differences between trails, between plants, between species, and all of those kinds of things. Okay. Now, what makes these individuals more cognitively complex than people in the United States and Germany? Well, if you think about it, if someone from the US or Germany went to go to the Amazon, we would have to take all our machinery, our navigation systems, our weapons. We would have to take our own food because we wouldn't know how to forage for food. We'd have to take all kinds of provisions, and we would still probably need a local indigenous tribe person to help us navigate the Amazon. So these individuals, even though they're considered stage three and stage four, could not survive in the Amazon because they don't have the cognitive ability to. All right. So from a cross-cultural perspective, what I would encourage you to know is that this is not a superior cognitive model. This is a model that states where what fits us best for our environmental demands is the cognitive resources that we will develop. Okay. So I want you to kind of think about those kind of different cultural aspects when you think about these different theories. Okay. All right. What time are we at right now? And we're at 6:20 already. All right, so we are going to stop here tonight, guys. I'm sorry, I didn't realize how late it was. I'm going to stop the recording and just real quickly put it in the chat. Does anybody have any questions? You can put no, yes, raise your hand, unmute yourself. But real quick, let's check in and make sure everyone's okay.